The wind in western Kansas has a way of finding what people try to hide. It moves across the grass like it is looking for something, a forgotten promise, a torn letter, a name a man swore he would protect. On the morning of September 14th, 1887, the wind found Ingrid Halverson standing alone beside two fresh graves. The first grave belonged to her husband, Eldon. He had died 7 months earlier in February, walking the 20 feet between the kitchen door and the well. A late winter squall came down off the plains without warning, and Eldon, strong as a draft horse, careful as a watchmaker, never made it back. They found him 3 days later, his face turned toward the house like a man who had simply grown tired and could not find his way home. The second grave was newer, 6 months newer to be exact. Abraham Halverson, her father-in-law, had followed his youngest son to the burial ground in August, an old man whose heart finally agreed with his grief. The minister said Abraham died of natural causes. Ingrid believed it was something quieter. Some men, she had learned, simply refused to outlive their favorite child. She stood between the two mounds and held her children's hands. Soren, her 8-year-old, kept his small face perfectly still. He had not cried at either funeral. He had decided somewhere in the months between that crying was something other boys did. Annalise Annika, they called her, was 5, and she was crying enough for both of them. Beside Annika stood Bjorn, the golden mountain dog Eldon had brought home as a wedding anniversary gift 2 years before he died. Bjorn pressed his big head against Annika's leg and did not move. The wind kept searching. Ingrid still remembered the morning Eldon died. It was the 14th of February. He had kissed her forehead before he went out. He had pulled on his heavy wool coat, the one his father had given him on his wedding day, and he had said in the half-laughing way he always said it on cold mornings, "Don't let the soup boil over my Ingrid. I will be back in 3 minutes." He was not back in 3 minutes. He was not back in 3 hours. The squall came down off the plains so fast that by the time she opened the kitchen door to look for him, the world outside was a wall of white. She called his name until her voice gave out. She walked the fence line 3 times in her apron with no coat. Soren ran for the neighbors. They searched until midnight. They searched all the next day. They searched the day after that. They found him on the morning of February 17th, his face turned toward the house, his right hand still gripping the empty bucket. He had lost his way between the well and the kitchen door, 20 feet of frozen ground that had killed him as surely as if it had been 20 miles. Ingrid had not been able to walk past the well since. Even now, 7 months later, she took the long way around the yard. The well belonged to Eldred now. Soon, even that would not be a problem. Behind Ingrid, half a mile across the prairie, stood the only home her children had ever known, the Halverson homestead. Whitewashed barn, deep well, 200 acres of working farmland, a herd of 43 head of cattle, a grain shed that smelled like every autumn she had ever loved. By that evening, none of it would belong to her. By that evening, it would all belong to Eldred. If you are listening to this story today, would you do me a small favor? Just tell me in the comments which state you are listening from. I want to know how far this story travels, because the woman you are about to meet was told she would not survive November. She lived another 60 years. The reading of the will took place at the kitchen table where Ingrid had served Abraham Halverson 10,000 meals. The kitchen still smelled like him, pipe tobacco, and lye soap, and the particular scent of a man who had worked the same fields for 41 years. Ingrid sat with Soren on her right and Annika on her left. Bjorn lay across her boots beneath the table, alert and unmoving. Across from her sat Eldred Halverson, her husband's older brother. 39 years old, broad-shouldered with the same blue eyes Eldon had, except where Eldon's eyes had been kind. Eldred's were calculating. He had brought his wife Birgit, a small quiet woman who would not meet Ingrid's gaze, and his 2 children who fidgeted in chairs too big for them. The lawyer had come down from Wichita that morning. His name does not matter. What matters is what he read. He read that the Homestead House Barnwell, cattle grain stores, 200 acres of cultivated bottomland, went entirely to Eldred Halverson, the eldest surviving son. He read that Ingrid Halverson, widow of the deceased Eldon Halverson, was to receive the following 1 mule 12 years of age, 1 wagon condition described as serviceable. The lawyer paused on that word like a man tasting something sour. 40 acres of unimproved land lying north of Cedar Draw described in the deed as broken country, unsuited to row crops, water uncertain, and the sum of 15 American dollars. The lawyer set the paper down. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Eldred reached into his vest pocket, pulled out 3 $5 coins, and slid them across the table. They made the smallest possible sound against the wood. "That ought to see you through to Thanksgiving," he said, and smiled the way a man smiles at a dog that has finally learned to stay down. Annika looked up at her mother. "Mama, why is Uncle Eldred keeping Grandpa's house?" The kitchen went very still. Birgit Halverson lowered her eyes to her lap. The 2 Halverson cousins stopped fidgeting. Even the lawyer seemed to find something interesting in the grain of the table. Ingrid Halverson did not answer her daughter. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She did not ask the lawyer to read the will a second time. She simply swept the 3 coins into her apron pocket, took her father-in-law's weather-stained ledger from where it sat on the counter, and stood up. She did not look at Eldred. Her eyes went past the warm hearth, past the windows that faced south toward the cattle, and out toward the broken country north of Cedar Draw, where the autumn wind was already gathering itself into something that smelled like an early winter. She had $15. She had 2 children. She had a dog and a mule and a wagon with a cracked sideboard. And she had 8 weeks until the first hard freeze. At the doorway, something unexpected happened. Reverend Obadiah Crow, who had witnessed the signing of the will, stepped between Ingrid and the door. He was a thin man in his 50s, with a face that always looked like he was about to apologize for something. He reached inside his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound book, Abraham Halverson's personal ledger, the one the old man had carried in his shirt pocket for 30 years. "Your father-in-law wanted you to have this," Reverend Crow whispered. His voice barely carried. "Don't let Eldred see it. Not now, not yet." He pressed the ledger into her hand and walked away before she could speak. Across the room, Eldred was still counting coins from the strongbox. He never looked up. The wagon left the homestead an hour later. Ingrid drove. Soren sat beside her with the leather ledger pressed against his chest like a shield. Annika sat in the back, holding on to Bjorn, who watched the receding farmhouse with the slow, suspicious eyes of a dog who knows when something has gone wrong. The road north was not really a road. It was a wheel track through buffalo grass, and the buffalo had been gone almost 20 years. The mule, whose name was Olaf, did not approve of the route, the load, or the woman driving. He communicated this opinion by stopping every half-mile and refusing to move until Ingrid climbed down and walked beside him. The land they came to was worse than she had feared. Gravel, sage, a few twisted weeds, the bones of something that had once been a cottonwood tree. 40 acres of country that looked like the prairie had given up halfway through making it. From the top of the rise she could still see the Halvorsen homestead in the distance, sunlight glinting off the creek smoke curling from the chimney. The barn roof straight and proud against the September sky. Soren climbed down from the wagon and stood very still. "Mama," he said quietly, "are we going back?" Ingrid followed his gaze toward the distant farmhouse. Then she looked down at the gravel beneath her boots. Then she looked at her son. "No, Soren," she said. "We build here." Annika began to cry again. Bjorn licked her face until she stopped. That night, the 4 of them slept in the wagon. Ingrid hung a quilt across the open back to block the wind. Annika coughed twice in her sleep, a small dry sound that Ingrid would remember for the rest of her life. The kind of cough that is not yet anything but could become anything at all if November came hard. When the children were finally asleep, Ingrid lit the lantern and opened Abraham's ledger for the first time. The first half was what she expected: rainfall figures, cattle weights, dates of first frost, going back to 1856. The handwriting was small and careful. Abraham had been a man who measured the world before he asked anything of it. But folded into the back of the ledger was something else. A letter. 3 pages. The handwriting was Abraham's, but shakier, the writing of an old man who already knew his heart was beginning to give. It was addressed to Eldon, her husband. It began, "My son, if you are reading this, then I am gone. Before you do anything else, you must protect Ingrid and the little ones. Eldred has done a thing I have feared for years. He has mortgaged this farm against the bank in Wichita without my knowledge, beginning in the spring of 1884. The debt is now considerable. If he inherits, the bank will own everything within 5 years, and he will lose it all chasing." The letter stopped there. The last page had been torn away. Cleanly, deliberately, the bottom half of the 3rd page was missing, as if someone had taken a sharp knife and cut the paper to remove whatever Abraham had wanted his son to know next. Ingrid stared at the torn edge for a long time. Someone had been through this ledger before her. Someone had removed the part that mattered most. She blew out the lantern. In the darkness, Bjorn shifted against her boot. She thought about her grandmother, Sigrun Halvorsen, who had taught her to read the wind in the mountains of Setesdal, Norway, when Ingrid was a girl. Sigrun had once said that a secret hidden in a house is like water under a floor. It doesn't go away just because you cannot see it. It only waits. Ingrid closed the ledger. She did not cry. She had decided the morning Eldon died that she had used up her lifetime supply of tears in a single February afternoon. But she lay awake until first light. The next morning she drove the wagon into Cedar Hollow proper. The small town 3 miles south of her claimed to learn exactly how impossible her situation was. The town consisted of a general store, a feed and seed warehouse, a Methodist church that doubled as the schoolhouse a livery, and a small bank that opened on Tuesdays. The store was owned by a man named Hiram Bramwell, who weighed 300 pounds, kept his pencil behind his ear, and had not lost $1 to bad arithmetic since 1872. Ingrid set her $15 on the counter and asked him what she could build with it. Hiram took the pencil from behind his ear. He added quietly for several minutes the way some men pray. When he was done, he looked up. "Mrs. Halvorsen," he said, The smallest framed cabin I can sell you the materials for 12 by 16 feet single wall. No porch, no foundation, just enough to keep a body alive would cost you $143. Lumber, nails, tar paper, stovepipe. That doesn't include the labor of building it. She did not move. I am a widow with 2 children, she said. I have $15. Hiram set the pencil down. His voice grew gentler than she had expected. Mrs. Halverson, I have known your husband's family for 19 years. I will say this once not as a merchant, but as a man who has buried a wife of his own. Sell that claim to Eldred. Take what he offers. Rent a room here in town for the winter. In the spring, you can decide what comes next. Pride is a luxury, ma'am, and you cannot afford luxuries this year. She heard him. She did not answer. She bought a small sack of flour, a packet of salt, a pound of dried beans, and 3 nails. The bill came to $1.10. She walked out of the store with $13.90, and the absolute certainty that $13.90 would not be enough. Before I tell you what she did with $13.90, let me ask you a question. If you were in her place, a widow, 2 children, mid-September in Kansas, what would you do? Type your answer in the comments. I read every one of them. Then come back, because what happened next surprised the whole town. For 3 days, Ingrid tried every cheap solution the prairie offered. She tried digging a well. The first hole collapsed at 4 feet when the gravel gave way. She tried digging in a different spot. That hole filled with sand. She tried cutting sod bricks, the prairie sod that other homesteaders had used for years to build sod houses. But her land was too dry. The grass roots were too brittle. The bricks crumbled in her hands like stale bread. On the 4th day, Annika began running a low fever. Not high, not yet. But the cough was wetter, and the nights were getting colder. That afternoon, a man rode up to the claim on a tall sorrel mare. He was perhaps 61 years old, lean and weather-cured with a carpenter's hands. His name was Cornelius Whitlock, and he had built half the cabins in 3 counties. He sat his horse for several minutes, without dismounting, his eyes moving over the broken wagon, the tired mule, the half-collapsed sod attempts, and finally to Ingrid herself. He took off his hat. Mrs. Halverson, he said, I knew your mother. Ingrid stiffened. She had not expected to hear that name out here. Astrid Carlson, Cornelius said. She came to this country in 1851. Pretty girl, smart, stubborn. He paused. I have come out here to give you advice, ma'am, and I want you to take it as kindness because that is how I mean it. He swung down off the horse and walked the property in a slow circle. When he came back, his voice was flat. A cabin built to standard 12 by 16 feet would cost you $187 in materials. It would take 2 men 4 weeks to raise. You have neither the money nor the men, and you have less than 8 weeks until the first hard freeze. He looked at Soren, then at Annika, then at Bjorn lying watchful beside the children. Mrs. Halvorsen, sell this claim to your brother-in-law. Go work for him through the winter. Start fresh in the spring. Ingrid said nothing. Cornelius put his hat back on. His next words came out very softly, and he did not look at her when he said them. Ma'am, you can be right in your heart and still bear your boy by Christmas. He mounted his horse and rode away. He did not look back. That night Annika's cough was worse. Ingrid held her until the child fell asleep. Then she stepped outside. The wagon walked 20 paces into the gravel, and stood under the cold autumn stars for a long time. She thought about Cornelius Whitlock's hands. They had been steady on the reins, a carpenter's hands, hands that built things that lasted. She thought about her grandmother Sigrun, who had hands like that too, but rougher, hands that knew straw, hands that had pulled a single hollow stem from the floor of a 200-year-old Halmhus in Setesdal, and held it up to a 12-year-old girl named Ingrid, and said in Norwegian, Lille Jente. Husk dette. Stille luft det beste teppet Gud lavet. Little girl, remember this. Still air is the best blanket God ever made. She walked back to the wagon. She did not sleep. In the morning, she drove the wagon to the Halvorsen homestead one final time. She left the children with Bjorn at the property line and walked the last quarter-mile alone. Eldred was in the yard with 4 hired men repairing a fence. He saw her coming, and he smiled the easy, comfortable smile of a man who has already won and is now being offered a chance to win again. "Sister," he said. "Did you come to your senses?" Ingrid held out her remaining coins. "I would like to buy some straw Eldred, the old bales, the ones too damp for feed." The 4 hired men slowed their hammers. Eldred laughed. It was not a cruel laugh that was the worst part. It was a comfortable laugh. The laugh of a man who finds the world arranged exactly the way he believes it ought to be. The straw is mine, Ingrid. The cattle are mine. The fence we're mending is mine. The mud under your boots is mine. He gestured grandly across the homestead. If you wish to build one of your dreams again, you should perhaps spend a little less time staring at the wind like it owes you something. The hired men looked away. Eldred stepped closer. Father was too soft on Eldon. Eldon was too soft on you. I am not. He paused. But because we are family, I will be generous. He walked behind the barn to where a pile of rotting straw bales lay forgotten beside a manure heap. He kicked one. It fell apart at the touch of his boot. Several others were stained dark with mildew. "There," he said. "Your portion. Suits a beggar woman better than feed straw anyway." Behind him, near the wagon track, Soren had appeared at the property line with Bjorn. The boy had walked the quarter-mile alone to make sure his mother was safe. Bjorn was beside him. The big golden dog took 2 steps toward Eldred and let out a low growl. Eldred turned and reached for a wooden stake leaning against the barn. "Get that dog off my land," he said, "or I will." Soren stepped between his uncle and Bjorn. He was 8 years old and weighed 62 pounds. He did not say anything. He just stood there small and steady between a grown man with a stick and a dog who had once slept across his cradle. Eldred lowered the stake. Ingrid bent down and began loading the rotten straw into the wagon, 1 armful at a time. She did not look at her brother-in-law. She did not look at the hired men. She loaded 46 damaged bales into the wagon, and the laughter behind her gradually faded into silence. And when she was finished, she climbed up onto the seat and clicked her tongue to Olaf the mule. As they pulled away, Eldred called after her, "Build with that if you still want to pretend sister one bundle at a time, then another, then another." She did not turn around. That night, under the lantern in the broken wagon, Ingrid pulled a single straw stem from one of the damaged bales. She held it close to the flame. She bent it. She broke it. The center was hollow. She pulled another. Also hollow. Another. Hollow. She rolled the stem between her fingers, and for a moment she was 12 years old again, standing in the doorway of a 200-year-old farmhouse in Setesdal, Norway, while her grandmother Sigrun pressed a hollow straw into her palm. The straw holds what the wind cannot take, lilla gente. One stem is nothing. 1,000 stems pressed tight is a wall. A wall of stems is 100,000 tiny rooms, each one too small for the cold to climb into. Ingrid looked over at Soren, who was awake watching her in the lantern light. "Mama," he whispered, "what are you thinking about?" She closed her hand around the hollow straw. "I am thinking about what cold cannot steal," she said. "And I am thinking, my Soren, that your great-grandmother Sigrun taught me something 22 years ago that nobody in this town knows. Not Hiram Bramwell. Not Cornelius Whitlock. Not your Uncle Eldred." Soren waited. "In the morning," she said, "we begin." Bjorn lifted his head, looked at her once, and then settled back against Annika as if the matter were now decided. Morning came gray and cold, and smelling of wood smoke from distant farms. Ingrid knelt in the gravel and drew the cabin on the ground with a sharpened stick, 14 feet by 18 feet, walls 2 feet thick, cedar stakes driven through every 16 inches, 3 feet long like the bones of the house, straw bales laid flat, not standing, so the binding twine would be hidden inside the wall. Each course staggered like brick, no two seams ever in line, so the wind could find no path through. The roof would be cottonwood poles, then old canvas, then 6 inches of sod laid grass down. The outside coated in 3 layers of plaster clay sandwood ash and chopped buffalo grass mixed thick as butter. She drew the door facing south, the window facing east, the stove on the north wall where the cold would meet the fire first. Soren crouched beside her studying the lines in the dirt. "Mama," he said, "does Bjorn get to sleep inside?" Ingrid smiled the first real smile in 6 months. "Bjorn will be the first to know if it works, my son. He sleeps closest to the door." Bjorn, hearing his name, thumped his tail twice against the gravel. For the next 3 weeks, the family did nothing but gather. Ingrid bartered labor a day, mending fence half a day, digging a neighbor's potato pit an afternoon, helping a widow named Mrs. Peterson carry her dead husband's tools into her barn in exchange for old straw bales that other farmers had given up on. She traded one of her remaining dollars for a wagon load of broken cedar limbs from a man who had cleared a stand for fence posts and had no use for the scrap. She split the cedar by hand into stakes 3 feet long, the points hardened in a small fire. Soren stripped bark. Annika gathered dried buffalo grass for the plaster, dragging it across the gravel in armfuls almost taller than herself. Bjorn contributed in his own way. He proudly carried home one at a time a length of forgotten rope, a discarded burlap sack, and on one memorable afternoon an entire broken broom handle that nobody could identify. Word traveled as word does in small Kansas towns. By the end of the first week, the whole of Cedar Hollow knew that the widow Halverson had begun building a house out of rotten straw on the broken country north of the draw. The reactions arrived almost as fast as the news. A rancher named Tate said the walls would be eaten by his cattle before Christmas. A blacksmith said the first hard wind would scatter her cabin across 3 counties. A schoolteacher said it was a pity that grief could push a sensible woman so far past sense. Eldred Halverson gave the house its name. The Widow's Beggar Barn. He said one Saturday in the general store, and the men around the stove laughed. By Monday, the name had reached the church. By Wednesday, it had reached the schoolchildren. Soren came home from his single weekly trip to the schoolhouse with a bruised cheek and would not say what happened. Ingrid did not ask. She washed his face, kissed his forehead, and put him back to work mixing plaster. That same week, a young man named Phineas Doherty, 24 years old, full of beer and certainty, stood up in the back of Hiram Bramwell's store and offered a wager. $5, Phineas announced. Says that straw pile falls down before Thanksgiving. And I'll eat my hat, gentlemen, the very hat on my head if that thing is still standing the first day of February. The wager was written in chalk on a slate behind Hiram's counter. It became over the following weeks a popular attraction. Ingrid heard about the slate. She kept stacking straw, but not everyone laughed. On a cold morning near the end of October, an older man rode up to the claim, heavy-set, white-bearded German accent, thick as winter butter. He dismounted, slowly walked around the rising walls of the beggar barn without speaking, and pressed his enormous hand flat against the half-finished north side. He closed his eyes. Halmhaus, he said softly. Mein Großvater hat das in Bayern gebaut. 60 Jahre alt und immer noch warm. He opened his eyes and looked at Ingrid. My grandfather built one of these in Bavaria, ma'am. 60 years old and still warm. He paused. My name is Friedrich Stellmacher. I came to Kansas in 1869. I have not seen a wall like this since I was a boy. He stayed for 2 hours. He helped her stagger a difficult seam at the southwest corner. He showed her a trick his grandfather had used for sealing the joint between the bottom course and the foundation, a thick paste of clay and ash mixed with cattle hair pressed into the gap while still warm. He refused payment. When he left, he tipped his hat to Soren scratched Bjorn behind the ears and said only, I will come back. He came back 4 times, and then on the 3rd of November the first autumn rain arrived. It was not a storm. That was the worst part. It was a slow, gray 2-day, soaking the kind of rain that prairie farmers actually welcomed, because it softened the fields for fall plowing. Ingrid welcomed it too at first. The cabin was nearly complete. The walls stood. The roof was on. The first coat of plaster had been smoothed across the exterior just 2 days before. She went to bed on the second night, listening to rain on the canvas and sod roof, feeling for the first time in months something close to peace. In the morning, she stepped outside and saw the cracks. They ran across the plaster like the veins on the back of an old man's hand. Some were thin. Some were the width of her finger. At the northwest corner, the plaster had pulled away from the wall in a strip nearly 2 feet long, and through the gap she could see the straw beneath, and the straw was darkening. Wet. The water had pooled at the base of the north wall, found a path under the foundation stones she had not yet finished laying, and was now wicking up into the bottom course of bales. Then Bjorn started barking. She found him at the back of the cabin, scratching furiously at the base of the wall. She pulled away a small section of loose plaster and saw the tiny tooth marks running through several exposed straws. Where the straw was wet, the mice had come. Annika, who had followed her mother around the corner, took one look at the chewed straw and the dark stain, and burst into tears. "Mama," she sobbed, "the house is broken. Can we go back to Grandpa's house now? Please, Mama, please." Soren said nothing. He just turned around and walked back inside and sat down on the dirt floor and stared at his hands. For the first time since the funeral, Ingrid felt something dangerously close to panic rise in her chest. She knelt in the wet gravel and breathed slowly until it passed. Then she stood up, wiped her hands on her apron, and went to look at the damage with the eyes of an engineer instead of a mother. The cracks were cosmetic. The mice were a real problem, but a fixable one. The wet straw at the bottom course was the danger. Wet straw rots. Rotted straw is a wall full of dust and silence and broken promises. She had to fix the foundation. She had to fix the plaster. And she had to do both with no money and no help. That night, after the children were asleep, there was a soft knock on the door frame. She opened the door, expecting Friedrich Stellmacher. It was a woman she had never spoken to. The visitor was perhaps 58 years old, small gray-haired with a face like a pressed handkerchief. She carried a heavy burlap sack and a coil of old rawhide strips. "Mrs. Halverson," she whispered, "my name is Matilda Whitlock. I am Cornelius's wife. May I come in, please? And if it is not too much to ask, please do not tell him I came." Hold on. Let me pause for a moment, because what Matilda Whitlock told Ingrid that night is going to change how you see this entire story. Before I tell you what she said, do me one small favor. Hit the like button if you have ever known the kind of small-town secret that travels through 3 generations before it finally finds the right person. I will wait. Tap the button. Then we will go back inside. Matilda sat on the only chair Ingrid owned. She set the burlap sack on the floor. "Wood ash," she said. 2 pounds, and rawhide. Enough for your sills. Use them. Do not tell my husband." Ingrid sat down on a crate across from her. "Why?" Matilda was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was very tired. "Mrs. Halverson, I have been married to Cornelius Whitlock for 38 years. He is a good man in most ways. He builds the strongest cabins in 3 counties. He has never raised his hand to me. He goes to church every Sunday." She drew a long breath. "But he is also a man who has carried a wound for 35 years, and that wound has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with you all the same." Ingrid waited. Cornelius was 26 years old in 1852. He was apprenticed to a master joiner in Topeka, and he was at the time in love with a girl named Astrid Carlson. Ingrid's hands went still on her lap. "Astrid was your mother, Mrs. Halverson. Cornelius asked her to marry him in the spring of 1852. She told him no. She said she had already given her promise to another man, a Norwegian boy, named Olaf Carlson, who had come over with nothing but a trunk and a Bible and the offer of 40 acres west of Lawrence. Cornelius never understood why she chose him. Olaf was poor, he was foreign, he could barely speak English. Cornelius could give her a house in a real town. He could give her a settled life." Matilda's voice grew softer. "Astrid married Olaf. They moved west. They had a daughter, and Cornelius spent the next 35 years convincing himself that he had been the better choice. He married me 2 years later. He has been a good husband. But there is a small part of him that has never stopped being angry at your mother for being right." Ingrid did not move. "When he rode out here," Matilda continued, "and he told you to sell your claim and go work for your brother-in-law, Mrs. Halverson, please understand. He was not being cruel. In his own mind, he was being kind. But he was also, without knowing it, hoping to see Astrid Carlson's daughter fail. Because if you fail, then he was right all along." Ingrid closed her eyes for a long moment. "And if I succeed?" she asked quietly. Matilda Whitlock smiled. It was the first time her face had moved all evening. "If you succeed, Mrs. Halverson, then perhaps a man who has been wrong for 35 years can finally come home." She stood up. She left the wood ash and the rawhide on the floor. At the door she turned back. "Please, do not tell him I came. Not yet. Let him find his own way to the truth." She walked out into the cold night, and Ingrid Halvorsen sat alone in her cracked, mouse-bitten, soggy-cornered, half-finished straw house, and understood for the first time in 7 months that she was not just rebuilding a cabin. She was rebuilding the answer her mother had given 35 years before. The repairs took 8 days. She dug a drainage trench 18 inches deep all the way around the cabin and filled it with river gravel from the bottom of cedar draw. She built a stone skirt 12 inches high around the base of the walls, flat limestone slabs, hauled by mule 2 at a time, set in clay mortar. The skirt blocked the mice, raised the bottom course of straw clear of any standing water, and gave the whole structure something the original plan had lacked: a foundation that looked even from a distance like it belonged to a real building. She remixed the plaster. 3 parts clay to 1 part, sand to 1 part wood ash that was Friedrich Stellmacher's German formula, and it was harder than the original. The ash made the mix slightly alkaline, which discouraged insects and rodents, and it cured to the hardness of soft stone. She added chopped buffalo grass for fiber. She added a handful of cattle hair Matilda had quietly slipped her, "Do not ask, dear, just use it." And the mix held together like something that had been engineered in a city. On the 3rd night of the repairs, Ingrid sat down on the dirt floor of the half-finished cabin and could not stand back up. Her hands were so swollen she could not close them around the spoon. Her back had stopped speaking to her in pain, and had begun instead to speak in a quiet, dangerous numbness. She had not eaten a full meal in 6 days. Every potato, every spoonful of beans, every scrap of dried meat had gone first to the children. Soren found her there. He was 8.5 years old. He had grown 2 inches since September, and looked in the lantern light like a small ghost of his father. He did not say anything. He went to the stove. He warmed a tin cup of broth water and salt, and a single chip of fat from a piece of bacon Mrs. Peterson had given them as payment for a day's work. He brought it to his mother. He held it to her lips because her hands could not. "Mama," he said quietly, "Papa would want you to eat first tonight." Ingrid drank the broth. Then she put her arms around her son and held him for a long time, and neither of them said anything, and outside the cold November wind moved across the prairie like something looking for what it could not find. In the morning she stood up. She finished the drainage trench. She mixed a new batch of plaster. She did not stop again. Soren became her foreman. He learned to mix plaster by feel. He learned to test the moisture of the straw with the back of his hand. He learned to listen for the soft, hollow sound that a healthy wall makes when you tap it with a knuckle. The sound of still air perfectly contained in 100,000 tiny rooms. Annika stopped coughing. That was the part Ingrid remembered most. The cough simply stopped the way some things do when a child finally believes she is safe. By the 8th of November, the house was whole again, stronger than before. The plaster was harder, the foundation was solid, the mice were gone. The cracks did not return. Ingrid hung a single object inside the door, a cracked thermometer she had bought at Hiram's store for 11 cents. And from that day on, every morning and every evening, she wrote in her father-in-law's ledger: outside temperature, inside temperature, wind direction, fuel burned, wall condition. The first cold night was the 11th of November. Outside 24 degrees, inside 39 degrees. No fire. She wrote the numbers down. She did not celebrate. The difference was only 15 degrees, and 15 degrees would not be enough in January. But the wall was working. The principle was sound. The hollow stems her grandmother had pressed into her hand in Setesdal in 1865 were still pressed 22 years later into the walls of a cabin in western Kansas, and they were still keeping out the cold. Soren leaned over her shoulder as she wrote. "Mama," he said, "is Grandpa Abraham proud, do you think?" Ingrid put her pen down. "I think," she said slowly, "that Grandpa Abraham knew something nobody else knew, and I think he gave us this land for a reason I have not yet figured out. But yes, my Soren, I think tonight he is proud." 2 weeks later, Eldred came to visit. He rode out alone on a Sunday afternoon with the casual ease of a man stopping by to see how a failed experiment had progressed. He tied his horse to the wagon, walked a slow circle around the cabin, and let out a long, theatrical whistle. "Well," he said, "the beggar barn still stands." He stepped inside without being invited. Ingrid was at the small table she had built from the wagon's broken sideboard. She did not stand up. Eldred looked around. He had expected perhaps a hovel wet straw drafts the smell of mildew. What he found was a single warm room smaller than his own kitchen, but undeniably comfortable. A small iron stove burning buffalo chips and dried sage. A clean dirt floor packed hard. The walls plastered smooth, almost elegant. The thermometer beside the door reading 51 degrees, while the wind outside had dropped to 19. He noticed. He did not admit it. A box of straw can fool a man for a few weeks, he said, hands on his hips. That doesn't make it a house. Ingrid kept writing. "You will see," she said quietly. He laughed, but the laugh was thinner than it had been at the homestead. He picked up the ledger from her shelf and flipped through the pages column after column of numbers in her small handwriting. Outside temperatures. Inside temperatures. Fuel burned. Wind direction. Wall condition. He frowned. "You have been measuring. Every day." "Numbers will not stop February, Ingrid." She finally looked up. Her voice was perfectly calm. "No," she said, "but walls might." Eldred set the ledger down a little too hard. He glanced at Soren, who was reading silently in the corner, and at Annika, who was braiding rope on the floor with Bjorn's tail across her lap. "Boy," Eldred said to Soren, "do you miss your grandfather's house?" Soren did not look up. He did not answer. Bjorn lifted his head and produced a low, slow growl, the kind of growl a dog gives when he is not yet committing, but wants the room to know he is paying attention. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Eldred walked out. He mounted his horse. Halfway down the slope toward Cedar Draw, he stopped and looked back at the cabin. Really looked at it for the first time with something other than contempt. Then he rode on. Reverend Obadiah Crow came to the cabin 3 weeks before Christmas. He brought a small sack of dried apples for Annika and a tin of coffee for Ingrid, and he sat on the only good chair, and he watched the children eat the apples in the warm light from the stove. He did not speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was the voice of a man who had been carrying a heavy stone in his pocket for months. "Mrs. Halverson, there is something I should have told you in September, and I did not, and I have prayed about it every night since." Ingrid set down her sewing. "I witnessed Abraham Halverson sign his will," Reverend Crow said. "But the will I witnessed was not the will that was read at that kitchen table. The will I witnessed divided this farm equally between Eldon and Eldred." When Eldon died in February, the law is clear his share would have passed to his widow and his children. To you, to Soren, to Annika. The room was very still. Eldred had a different will drawn up after Eldon died. He took it to his father in August when the old man was already dying, and he had him sign it. Whether Abraham understood what he was signing, I do not know. I suspect he did not. But it was that second will that was read in the kitchen. And you said nothing, Ingrid said. Reverend Crow's face crumpled. He looked in that moment like a man 20 years older than he was. Eldred holds the mortgages of 19 families in this county. The Methodist Church owes him $340. If I had spoken in September, ma'am, my congregation would have lost its building by November. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself I was protecting more people than I was hurting. I was lying to myself. I was a coward. He reached into his coat and pulled out a sealed envelope. This contains the original will, and a letter from Abraham sealed with his own hand that he asked me to give to you when the time was right. He paused. It is not yet the right time, Mrs. Halverson. You are not yet strong enough to stand against your brother-in-law. He still has too much power in this town. But you will be, and when you are, you will know, and then you will open this. He set the envelope on the table. He left without finishing his coffee. Ingrid stared at the sealed envelope for a long time. She did not open it. She put it under her father-in-law's ledger on the small shelf she had built above the stove, and she went back to her sewing. Outside, the wind was beginning to gather itself. Far to the north, somewhere beyond the Dakotas, somewhere over the Canadian plains, a mass of Arctic air was beginning to move south. She did not know it yet, but she had 37 days. January came in like a slow, patient executioner. By the 7th, the morning thermometer read 4 degrees below zero. By the 9th, 11 below. Across Cedar Hollow, the wood piles that had looked so generous in October began to shrink. Coal supplies, never plentiful, ran short by the second week. Families that had built their cabins to the standards Cornelius Whitlock had spent 40 years perfecting proper studs, tar, paper, lap, siding, lath, and plaster interiors. Those families fed their stoves day and night, and still woke to find their water buckets skinned with ice by morning. In the Halvorsen straw cabin north of Cedar Draw, the fuel pile was barely smaller than it had been in November. Ingrid kept measuring. January 7th, outside -4, inside 53. January 9th, outside -11, inside 51. January 11th, outside -19, inside 48. Each morning the same ritual. The thermometer, the ledger, the careful column of numbers in her small, patient handwriting. Soren had stopped asking when they would go back to Grandpa's house. He had started sometime around New Year's calling the straw cabin our house. He said it casually, the way he might have said our wagon or our dog. Ingrid had not corrected him. She had turned her face to the stove and stirred the soup and let her eyes water from the steam. Annika had not coughed in 9 weeks. On the 11th of January, an old man rode out to the cabin. He was 89 years old, white-haired, blue-eyed, with hands knotted by decades of farm work. His name was Torvald Carlson, and he was the oldest Norwegian-born resident of Bonner County. He had come to America from Telemark in 1828 as a young man of 30. He had built 3 farms, buried 2 wives, and outlived 4 of his 6 children. He walked into the cabin without knocking. He looked around. He touched the wall. He turned slowly, taking in every detail, and finally he sat down on the edge of the table and looked at Ingrid with eyes that had not been surprised by anything in 50 years. "Halmhus," he said softly. "Halmhus," she answered. He nodded slowly. "My grandmother had one, in Telemark. She lived in it 91 years. He paused. "Du har gjort henne stolt, Ingrid. Du har gjort dem alle stolt. You have made her proud, Ingrid. You have made them all proud." He drank 1 cup of coffee. He did not say much else. When he left, he simply tipped his hat to Soren, scratched Bjorn behind the ears, and rode away. Bjorn watched him go from the doorway. Then that night, the big golden dog took up a new position. He no longer slept beside Annika. He slept beside the door. And every few hours all through the night he raised his head and looked north. Ingrid noticed. She did not yet understand what he was listening for. But the dog knew the way dogs always know that something was coming. The morning of January 12th, 1888, broke unusually warm. The history books would later call it the children's blizzard, or the schoolhouse blizzard, depending on which county you grew up in. By the time it was over, 2 days later, 235 lives would be gone from the Great Plains, most of them children, walking home from country schoolhouses in light coats. But on the morning of January 12th, none of that had happened yet. Across the Great Plains from Montana to Texas, the temperature climbed into the 30s, and even the 40s. Children walked to schoolhouses without their heavy coats. Farmers stepped out into their barnyards in shirt sleeves. The unseasonable warmth was so striking that people remarked on it in letters that would later be found in attic trunks stained with the tears of people who had lost everything. In Cedar Hollow, the warmth lasted until just past noon. Ingrid was outside behind the cabin splitting cottonwood for the stove when she felt the air change. It was not a wind at first. It was a pressure, a sudden, almost physical drop, as if the entire sky had inhaled. The cottonwood she had just split lay still on the chopping block. The sagebrush at the edge of the gravel went perfectly silent. Even Bjorn, who had been pacing near the door, stopped and lifted his nose. Then she saw the wall. It was coming down from the north, a wall of cloud blue-black at the top, white-gray at the bottom, moving across the prairie at a speed she had never seen weather move. It was not falling toward them. It was running, like a thing alive. "Children," she said. Her voice was perfectly calm. "Inside. Now." Soren grabbed Annika's hand. Bjorn herded them through the door. Ingrid threw an armful of cottonwood inside, slammed the door, dropped the latch, and pressed her palm flat against the inside of the wall. The wall hit 20 seconds later. The sound was not like wind. It was like a freight train running through the cabin, not past it, through it. The plastered straw walls absorbed the sound and gave back only a low, deep, almost musical hum like the inside of a great cathedral. The lantern on the table did not even tremble. Outside, in less than 4 hours, the temperature dropped from 38 degrees above zero to 34 degrees below. A drop of 72 degrees. In the straw cabin north of Cedar Draw, the thermometer read 55 degrees. Ingrid sat down on the edge of the bed and pulled both children against her, and Bjorn pressed himself against her boots, and outside the wind tried to find a way in, and could not. Pause here for just a moment. If you have ever sat with someone you love during a storm and felt that strange calm certainty that comes from knowing the roof will hold type the word Amen in the comments. Just the one word. Then come back, because what happened in the next 36 hours is the heart of why I am telling you this story at all. The first knock came 2 hours after dark on the night of the storm. Bjorn heard it before Ingrid did. He was on his feet, barking before there was anything for human ears to hear. Then, faintly beneath the freight train roar of the wind, a man's voice. A woman's voice. The high, thin cry of a child. Ingrid lifted the latch. The wind tried to take the door from her. She held it. Standing in the whiteout, frosted to the eyebrows, his face the color of wet ash, was Cornelius Whitlock. Behind him stood Matilda Whitlock, holding their 7-year-old granddaughter Emma, a small girl who lived with them whose parents had died of typhoid 2 years before. The child was completely silent. Her lips were blue. Cornelius could not speak. He simply looked at Ingrid with a man's whole life of mistakes in his eyes. Ingrid stepped aside. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Matilda carried Emma to the stove. Soren, 8 years old foreman of the cabin, pulled the second blanket off his own bed and wrapped the small girl in it. Bjorn lay down beside her. The big golden dog put his head on her small shoes, and after several minutes the child reached out one slow blue hand and touched his ear. Her first words when she finally spoke came nearly 4 hours later. "Mrs. Halverson, can I pet your dog?" Matilda began to weep silently into her hands. Cornelius stood in the middle of the room, snow melting from his coat in slow drips, and he looked at the walls he had said would never stand. He pressed his bare hand flat against the plaster. He closed his eyes. "My God," he whispered. Astrid was right. He did not say anything else for a long time. The second knock came shortly before midnight on the second night. By then, the blizzard had passed, and an Arctic outbreak had taken its place colder than the storm, but still as glass. The wind had died. The temperature had not. Outside the cabin, thermometer read 31 degrees below zero. Inside, with 8 bodies now adding their warmth to the room, the temperature held at 57. Bjorn rose from his place beside Emma and went to the door. He did not bark. He whined low and uncertain the way a dog whines when he does not know whether to be glad or angry. Ingrid opened the door. Eldred Halvorsen stood on her threshold. Behind him stood his wife Birgit and his 2 small children, Caleb 6 and Mary 4. Both children were crying. Eldred's face was the color of bone. His lips were blue. There was frost in his beard. He had walked nearly 2 miles through 30 below zero because the roof of his grain shed had collapsed under the weight of snow at sundown, and the main house, the warm, beautiful Halverson homestead, the house Abraham had built and Eldred had inherited, could no longer hold the cold out. He stood on her threshold with one boot inside her cabin and one boot still in the snow, and he could not make himself cross. His pride would not let him. He opened his mouth. No sound came out. It was Soren who moved. The 8-year-old boy crossed the room, took his uncle's gloved hand in both of his small ones, and tugged him gently forward over the threshold. "Uncle Eldred," Soren said. "Come in. Mama built the house big enough for everyone. Papa would want it." Eldred Halverson, 39 years old, owner of the largest farm in the township, the man who had laughed across a kitchen table 4 months earlier and called the woman in front of him a beggar, sat down on the dirt floor of her straw cabin and put his face in his hands and wept like a child. Birgit, his wife, did not look at Eldred. She walked straight to Ingrid and took both of her hands. "Forgive me," she whispered. I knew about the will. I was a coward. Forgive me." Ingrid kissed her sister-in-law's frozen forehead and said nothing. There was nothing at that moment that needed to be said. 11 people, 1 dog, 1 stove, 1 room 14 feet by 18 feet. The next 3 days lasted in Ingrid's memory the length of a small lifetime. Phineas Doherty arrived just after dawn on the 3rd day, half carried by Friedrich Stellmacher, who had walked nearly 4 miles through the deep snow to bring him. Phineas had tried to ride out the storm in his rented room above the livery, and had lost 2 toes from his left foot to frostbite. He could no longer feel his fingers. When Friedrich and Ingrid pulled off his boots, the smaller toe broke off in Friedrich's hand like a dry twig. Phineas did not cry out. He simply stared at the ceiling of the straw cabin and said very softly, "I called you a fool. I called you a fool while you were building the only thing that could save me. I will never forget that, Mrs. Halverson, as long as I live." Ingrid knelt beside him and placed her cold hand on his forehead the way she had once placed her hand on Soren's forehead when he had a fever as a baby. "You did not know," she said. "Now you do. That is enough." Phineas Doherty closed his eyes. A single tear ran down his temple into his hair. He would keep that promise for 51 more years. But the keeping of it belongs to a part of the story still to come. On the 2nd morning, Ingrid did the arithmetic of survival. There were 8 pounds of dried beans in the bin, 3 pounds of flour, a small crock of lard, half a sack of cornmeal, a jar of preserved tomatoes Matilda had brought with her tied inside her shawl, a canvas sack of dried apples Reverend Crow had carried 6 miles through the snow. It would last, she calculated, perhaps 5 days if they were careful. They were careful. Birgit Halverson, who in her own warm kitchen had directed 3 hired women and never lifted a heavy pot in her life, sat down beside Ingrid on the 2nd morning and asked simply, "Tell me what to do." She peeled potatoes. She kneaded flatbread on the lid of the trunk. She rocked Mary, her 4-year-old, against her shoulder for hours at a time, so that Ingrid could sleep. Cornelius Whitlock spent most of the 2nd day mending things. He fixed the broken sideboard of the wagon, working through the doorway with the door cracked just enough to let in the cold sting of Arctic air. He repaired the latch. He oiled the hinges. He carved from a piece of cottonwood a small whittled dog that he gave to Mary on the 2nd evening. The little girl held it against her chest like a doll and did not let it go for 2 days. Soren read aloud to the children. He read from the only book Ingrid had brought from the homestead, her mother's worn copy of the Norwegian fairy tales, the ones about 3 goats and a troll and a girl who could spin gold. He read them in English slowly because Mary and Caleb did not speak Norwegian. Annika, who knew the stories by heart, prompted him quietly when he forgot a word. Bjorn moved from person to person all day, like a doctor on his rounds. He lay beside Emma in the morning. He pressed against Mary at midday. He slept across Phineas Doherty's blanket-wrapped feet at night because Phineas could not feel his feet, and Bjorn somehow understood that this was a problem a dog could solve. Eldred did not speak for almost 2 full days. He sat with his back against the south wall, his hands on his knees, and he watched. He watched his wife knead bread for the first time in 19 years of marriage. He watched his children eat from a single tin cup shared with the children of a woman he had called a beggar. He watched his nephew read to his daughter. He watched a yellow dog he had once threatened with a stick lie patiently beside a man whose toes had broken off in another man's hand. On the evening of the 2nd day, Eldred Halverson finally lifted his head. He looked across the small warm room at his sister-in-law. and for the first time in his life, he saw her clearly. Reverend Crow arrived on the morning of the fourth day, somehow having walked nearly 6 miles in a borrowed coat, carrying a small canvas sack of dried beans and a Bible. He came inside, looked around at the 11 people warm and breathing in a single room, and sat down on the floor next to Annika and Emma without saying a word. He stayed 3 hours. Before he left, he simply touched the top of Ingrid's head, the way a father touches the head of a daughter, and he walked back out into the snow. Annika developed a small cough on the 4th night. Ingrid heard it across the room and went perfectly still, and for one terrible moment, the whole inside of her chest was the kitchen of the Halverson homestead in February. And Eldon was not coming back from the well, and the snow was burying everything. Matilda Whitlock was already moving. The older woman boiled water on the stove, added a pinch of salt and a spoonful of honey from Friedrich's pocket, and held the cup to Annika's lips. Bjorn lay across the little girl's feet. By morning, the cough had not gotten worse. By the 2nd morning after it was gone. On the morning of the 5th day, the sun came out. Ingrid opened the door of the cabin and stepped outside into a world that had been remade. Snowdrifts reached the bottom of the single window. The wagon was nearly buried. Sagebrush and gravel, and the broken line of the road north, all of it gone, replaced by a smooth, glittering white country that did not look like Kansas at all. The thermometer read 12 below zero. Inside the cabin still read 49 degrees. She stood in the doorway for a long time. The light was the kind of light that exists only after a great storm, clean, hard, almost holy. The air did not move. Behind her, Eldred Halverson came and stood at her shoulder. He did not say, "I'm sorry." He did not say thank you. Neither of those words was big enough for what had happened in that room. He said instead the only thing that mattered. Father knew. Ingrid did not turn her head. "Yes," she said. "I believe he did." She brought the sealed envelope down from the shelf that afternoon. Reverend Crow had told her she would know when the time was right. The time was right. She knew it the way she had known 22 years ago in Satisdal, that her grandmother was telling her something she would need someday in a country she had not yet seen. She broke the seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was the original will of Abraham Halverson, dated May of 1886, a year before Eldon's death. It divided the homestead equally between his 2 sons. The signatures of 3 witnesses, including Reverend Crow, were dated and notarized. The second document was a single sheet of paper, folded into thirds, sealed with red wax, that had the imprint of Abraham's signet ring. The handwriting was the same shaky hand she had seen in the torn letter 4 months earlier. But this letter was complete. This letter was for her. She read it aloud slowly while every adult in the room sat perfectly still. Ingrid, my daughter-in-law, if you are reading this, then Eldon has gone before me, and Eldred has done the thing I have feared for years. I know my elder son. I know his weaknesses. I have known them since he was a boy. He looks at the land and sees only what he can take from it. He has never once asked the land what it would give him freely if he only had the patience to listen. The 40 acres north of Cedar Draw are not what they appear to be. In the summer of 1877, I drilled a test well in the northwest corner of that parcel, where the ground sounds different under a horse's hoof. At 32 feet I struck water. Not a trickle, Ingrid. A river. A clean, cold, underground river large enough to irrigate 600 acres. large enough, in fact, to supply the entire town of Cedar Hollow if it were ever developed. I capped the well. I told no one, not even Eldon. I knew that if Eldred ever learned of it, he would borrow against it until the bank owned it. I knew that if the town ever learned of it, the speculators would come, and the price of every acre within 10 miles would multiply, and the small farmers I had spent my life beside would be driven out. I left that land to you, Ingrid, for a reason that has nothing to do with what is under it, and everything to do with what is inside you. You lived in Setesdal until you were 12. You sat at Sigrun's knee. You learned things that nobody in this country knows. And you have my dear daughter, the one quality that neither of my sons inherited from me, the patience to wait for what is hidden to reveal itself in its own time. Eldred will always look down at the dirt. You will learn in time to look down into it. The well cap is marked with a small cross cut into a flat limestone slab. You will find it 60 paces north of the great cottonwood stump in a slight depression where the buffalo grass grows greener than around it. Use it wisely. Use it slowly. Share it with those who have shared with you. And forgive my elder son when the time comes, because his crime against you was a crime first against himself. I loved you from the first day Eldon brought you home. He told me you reminded him of his mother. He was right. Abraham Halverson. July the 9th, 1887. The room was perfectly silent. Eldred Halverson sat on the dirt floor with both his hands pressed flat against his face, and he did not lift them for a very long time. When he finally did, his eyes were wet, and he was looking not at Ingrid but at Soren, the 8-year-old boy who had pulled him through the doorway. Father always loved Eldon more, Eldred said quietly. I never understood why. Soren looked at his uncle with the calm, level gaze of a child who has already grown into the man he will become. Maybe, Soren said, it was because Papa was the one who listened. The snow began to melt in the second week of February. Eldred returned to the homestead. He stayed only long enough to gather his family, his account books, and a single trunk of clothes. The rest of the farm, every acre, every cow, every grain of stored wheat he signed over to Ingrid and her children at the bank in Wichita on the 17th of February. He did not ask for anything in return. He did not say goodbye in any formal way. He simply rode west alone with Birgit, and the children following in a borrowed wagon, and the last anyone in Cedar Hollow saw of Eldred Halverson was the back of his coat disappearing over the rise toward Wyoming. He wrote one letter 6 years later from a small ranch outside Sheridan. It was addressed to Soren, not to Ingrid. It said, in its entirety, Boy. I have been thinking all these years about the night you took my hand. I have not been able to deserve it, but I have not stopped trying. Your uncle, E. Soren, kept the letter in the back of Abraham's ledger for the rest of his life. Reverend Obadiah Crow preached one final sermon in Cedar Hollow on the first Sunday in March of 1888. He stood in front of his congregation. Eldred Halvorson was not there. He had already left for Wyoming, and he told them plainly what he had done. He told them about the second will. He told them about the cowardice that had kept him silent through the autumn. He told them that he had let a young widow with 2 children walk into a Kansas winter with $15 in her apron pocket because he had been afraid of losing a building. Then he resigned his pulpit. He did not leave the town. He stayed in Cedar Hollow for the rest of his life 21 more years, and he worked as a clerk in Hiram Bramwell's store. And on Sunday afternoons he visited the sick and the poor and the people nobody else thought to visit. The Methodist Conference sent a new minister. The new minister was younger, and his sermons were more polished, and the congregation never quite trusted him the way they had trusted Obadiah Crow. Because Obadiah Crow was the man who sat in the third pew every Sunday with his hat on his knee, and reminded them by his presence alone what it had cost to lie. He died in 1909 in a small room above Hiram Bramwell's store with Ingrid Halverson holding his hand. His last words were, "Thank you for letting me come home." Cornelius Whitlock came to the cabin once more that spring. He came alone on foot, walking the 4 miles from his own farm, because he said he wanted a time to think before he arrived. He stood in front of the south wall of the cabin for several minutes with his hat in his hand. Then he knocked. When Ingrid opened the door, the old carpenter could not look at her at first. "Mrs. Halverson," he said. "Astrid Carlson made the right choice in 1852. I have been wrong about that for 35 years. I came here today to say so in front of God and you in the wall your grandmother taught you to build. I am sorry. I am ashamed. And if you will have me, I would like to spend whatever years I have left learning what your people knew that mine did not." Ingrid stepped aside. Cornelius Whitlock spent the next 11 years apprenticing himself at the age of 62 to a 34-year-old widow who had built her first house out of straw. He learned to mix the German plaster. He learned to stagger the joints. He learned to drive cedar stakes through the bones of a wall. By the time he died in the spring of 1899, he had helped Ingrid build 43 more straw houses across Bonner County, and not one of them ever fell down. Phineas Doherty kept his word. He lived another 51 years. He never gambled again, not so much as a penny on a horse race. He told the story of his missing toes at every threshing dinner and every Thanksgiving table, until the day he died in 1939, always ending it the same way. "Boys, the smartest woman in 3 counties was a widow nobody believed in. Don't ever make that mistake." The slate behind Hiram Bramwell's counter, the one that had once recorded the bets against the Beggar Barn, was wiped clean in March of 1888 and never used for betting again. Hiram replaced it the following year with a small hand-painted sign that read in plain black letters, "Halmhus Repairs and Consultations. Inquire within." He charged no commission. He simply liked, he said, to be on the right side of history for a change. One last pause before I tell you what happened to the cabin. If this story has reached you tonight, would you do me one final favor? Share it with one person. You know, one person you think might be quietly building their own straw house in their own corner of America. A person nobody believes in. A person who is being told to give up. They need to hear that it can be done. Then come back. I have one more thing to tell you. The well in the northwest corner of the property was uncovered in the summer of 1888. Ingrid did exactly what Abraham had asked. She did not sell the water rights. She did not allow speculators onto the land. She drilled 3 modest wells, irrigated her own fields, and offered free water access to any small farmer within 5 miles who needed it. By the harvest of 1891, Cedar Hollow had become one of the most productive small townships in western Kansas. By 1895, it had grown from a population of 112 to a population of 470. None of the original families lost their farms. None of them were driven out by speculators. The speculators never came because Ingrid Halvorsen never let them know what was under her land. She lived in the straw cabin for the rest of her life. She added a second room in 1893, a small kitchen wing in 1901, a wooden porch in 1907 because Bjorn, now an old white-muzzled dog of 14, had begun to find the dirt threshold hard on his legs. The original walls were patched twice, plastered 3 times, but never replaced. Bjorn died in his sleep on the porch in the autumn of 1898, at the age of 15 years and 3 months. He was buried beside the north wall beneath a flat limestone slab that Soren, by then 19 years old, studying agricultural engineering at Kansas State Agricultural College, cut and carved himself. The inscription read, B. Jorn, 1883-1898. He pulled the widow back from the storm. Soren went on to become a soil and water engineer. He designed irrigation systems across 3 states. He married a girl from Lindsborg in 1903 and had 4 children, every one of whom he raised in a small straw house. He built himself on a parcel of land adjoining his mother's. Annika became a school teacher. She taught in the Cedar Hollow Schoolhouse for 41 years. Her students remembered her as the woman who began every winter by telling the story of the storm of 1888, not as a tale of triumph, but as a lesson in still air hollow stems and the dignity of patient women. She had her own way of telling the story. She would gather the children around the small iron stove of the Cedar Hollow Schoolhouse, the same schoolhouse where her brother Soren had once come home with a bruised cheek, and would not say what happened, and she would tell them slowly the way her mother had told her. She would tell them about hollow straw. She would tell them about a grandmother in Norway who had lived to be 94 years old in a house made of stems. She would tell them about a widow with $15 and a dog and a mule named Olaf, and 2 children, and how that widow had built a wall that held when every wall in town had failed. She would always end the story the same way. Children. She would say, in your lives you will be told a great many times that something cannot be done. You will be told it by people who love you. You will be told it by people who mean you well. And sometimes those people will even be right. But sometimes, children, they will only be repeating what they were told. And on those days, you must remember the grandmother of your grandmother knew something that the doctor in town does not. Listen to the old hands. Listen to the old voices. They are still trying to keep you warm. Her students remembered the story for the rest of their lives. In 1962, when an ice storm took down power lines across half of Kansas for 9 days, 3 of Annika's former students survived in well-insulated straw additions they had built behind their houses on her advice. None of them ever forgot whom they had learned from. Ingrid Halvorsen died peacefully in her own bed, in the south room of the straw cabin she had built with her own hands on the morning of April 12, 1947. She was 94 years old. Soren was beside her. Annika was holding her right hand. There was a young golden mountain dog, a great-great-grandson of Bjorn, asleep across her feet. Her last words, according to Annika, were spoken in Norwegian very softly, stille luft. Det beste teppet Gud lavet. Still air. The best blanket God ever made. Soren buried his mother beside his father in the small family plot on the rise overlooking the cabin she had built. He carved both stones himself. His father's stone reads, Eldon Halvorsen, 1849-1887. He walked 20 feet into the storm and never came home. His mother's stone reads, Ingrid Halvorsen, 1853-1947. She built the wall that brought him home again. That, my friends, is how a marriage outlasts a winter. In the summer of 1978, 90 years after the schoolhouse blizzard, a team of agricultural engineers from Kansas State University traveled to Bonner County to study the surviving straw houses of the Halverson tradition. The team was led by Professor Marcus Reinhold, a soil and structures engineer who had grown up 2 counties south and had heard the story of the beggar barn from his own grandmother. The team measured 47 straw houses still standing in the area. They measured wall thickness, plaster composition, thermal performance, structural integrity, and rodent resistance. They published their findings in a paper that appeared in the Journal of Vernacular Architecture in the spring of 1979. The numbers astonished the engineering community. The original Halverson cabin, by then 91 years old, still occupied by Soren Halverson's youngest daughter, measured an R value of 33. Modern passive house construction, the absolute gold standard of energy-efficient building in 1978, required a minimum R value of 30. The walls Ingrid Halverson had built with rotten straw and prairie clay in 1887 exceeded the passive house standard of nearly a century later. The fuel efficiency of the cabin, compared to a conventional frame house of the same era, was 2.4 times higher. The walls had withstood every storm western Kansas had thrown at them for 9 decades, including the dust storms of the 1930s and the ice storm of 1962 with only routine maintenance. The Wichita Eagle ran a feature on the team's findings in May of 1979. The headline read, "Norwegian Widow's Straw Barn Anticipated Passive House by 100 Years." The reporter interviewed Soren Halverson, who was by then 99 years old and living in a small straw house his mother had helped him design in 1908. The reporter asked him whether he had ever doubted his mother during the building of the original cabin. Soren thought about it for a long time before he answered. "Sir," he said, finally, "the day my father died, I stopped doubting my mother about anything. I was barely 8 years old. I have never seen any reason since then to change my mind." He died 8 months after the interview in his sleep in the straw house he had built with his own hands. The original Halverson cabin, all 40 acres of the surrounding land, and the underground well that Abraham had hidden in 1877 were donated to the Kansas Historical Society in 1981 by the last of Soren's children. The cabin is a registered historic site. It is open to visitors 3 days a week during the warmer months. A small plaque beside the door reads, "Built by Ingrid Halverson, widow, in the autumn of 1887 with 15 American dollars, a mule, a wagon, 2 children, 1 dog, and a secret her grandmother taught her in Norway in 1865. Still air is the best blanket God ever made." The wall on the north side of the cabin, the wall where Bjorn is buried, still stands today. It has not been replastered since 1989. There are houses built of wood. There are houses built of stone. And there are houses built of all the things that other people threw away: broken promises, torn letters, hidden truths, and a widow whom nobody in her town believed would live to see February of 1888. Ingrid Halvorsen did not build a house. She built a piece of evidence that the knowledge your grandmother carried in her hands may be worth more than every diploma in your town. She built a place where 11 people sheltered in a single room, while the prairie tried to kill everything outside. She built a memorial to a husband who died 20 feet from his own kitchen door, and to a father-in-law who left her 40 acres of broken country, because he saw in her the only person in his family with the patience to wait for what was hidden. She built proof that being told you cannot do a thing is not the same as being told the truth. And if you have been listening to this story tonight, if you have been carrying your own small impossible thing through your own cold autumn with people you love who do not yet believe, I want you to remember Ingrid Halverson. I want you to remember the hollow straw. I want you to remember that still air pressed tight inside 1,000 small rooms can keep a child alive through a night that takes 235 lives across 4 states. The wall is still standing. Your wall can stand too. If this story moved you tonight, would you share it with one woman in your life who needs to hear it? A mother, a daughter, a sister, a friend. Anyone you know who is building something with hollow straw while the town laughs. Tell her this story. Tell her about Ingrid. Tell her the wall is still standing, and then, before you close your phone, tell me one thing in the comments. Tell me her name. Just her first name. I will read every single one. Because somewhere out there tonight, another widow is building another wall, and she needs to know she is not alone, she is not crazy, and she is not building her children's grave. She is building their inheritance. Good night from Cedar Hollow. Good night from the beggar barn. Good night from the wall that is still standing.